Escalating climate chaos is daily illustrating the fragility, precarity, and folly of the human endeavor. Not only does nature bat last, it's also her playing field, and she's the referee. Nature's done everything we want to do without minding the past or mortgaging the future. It's nature's intelligence that we need to turn to right now, not artificial intelligence. The source code is nature's operating instructions, and it's a code of interdependence. It starts with the Gaia hypothesis, which Ferris Jaber so eloquently described yesterday, and which also echoes ancient indigenous knowledge. Earth, said Lynn Margulis, is a symbiotic planet. Just as our bodies know how to regulate themselves, the entire jazz symphony of all living things self-regulates Earth conditions to make the physical environment hospitable for life in an exquisite dynamic balance. Think of it as a vast hospitality enterprise, or in the immortal words of Janine Benyus, what life does is to create conditions conducive to life. This Gaian view puts the climate crisis in a very different light. The root of the problem is not per se the colossal CO2 emissions from burning fossil fuels. It turns out that the large-scale human destruction of landscapes has apparently contributed as much CO2 to the atmosphere as fossil fuels, which is a really significant new piece of data. Although this has taken place over the last 12,000 years, it radically spiked over the past 500 years since European colonization was turbocharged by capitalism and fossil fuels, which are kind of like the crack of energy. So it's actually the regeneration of living systems that's the golden key to solving the climate crisis, and that's just the beginning. As Brett KenCairn puts it, the poly-crisis requires poly-solutions. The farmer philosopher Wendell Berry called this solving for pattern. It means taking a systemic approach that solves multiple problems at once without creating dreadful new ones. The large-scale deployment of regenerative nature-based solutions solves for pattern in multiple ways. Perhaps most salient, we address the cold fact that we're already in the hot zone. It's not enough to deploy renewable energy at scale. We've got to draw carbon down out of the atmosphere, which thankfully Gaia already knows how to do really well. By scaling nature-based solutions, it may actually be possible to stabilize the climate within 2 decades and start to bring things back down to the Goldilocks effect. This regenerative approach also presents a vast new global economy of restoration, and it will be the single biggest job creator in history. It addresses the migration crisis because you need people to stay in place and take care of their own local ecosystems and communities. That includes very much supporting the land rights and legal protections of First Peoples to sustain their guardianship of vast landscapes that hum with much of the Earth's remaining biodiversity. And because extreme inequality is at the molten core of the global poly-crisis, solving for pattern requires any authentic solution to put equity at the center. No more monopoly board, no more 1%. But at the end of the day, as Yogi Berra said, it's not the heat, it's the humility. My guru, Yogi Berra. As human beings, we can play our part as junior partners. We can act as healers, and in healing Earth, we heal ourselves. This is Brett's work, healing the climate crisis and ourselves through regenerative nature-based solutions. Brett's a 40-year veteran of land stewardship, community resilience, and systems change. He's spent his career building bridges between what is and what could be. He first began working in the Pacific Northwest on sustainable forestry certification. There he helped launch one of the country's first sustainable forestry certification initiatives and helped found the International Forest Stewardship Council. He went on to direct the Grand Canyon Forest Partnership to develop a 100,000-acre restoration forestry strategy around Flagstaff, Arizona. Through relationships forged with Navajo communities, he helped found indigenous community enterprises to create traditional hogan-shaped log homes. It was later subsumed by the Navajo Housing Authority to support elder housing. In 2013, Brett joined the City of Boulder's Climate Initiatives Department. There he's built the entire the city's nature-based solutions division, which he leads today. He also founded the Center for Regenerative Solutions, which is a national capacity building organization working with local governments to advance nature-based, biodiversity-centered solutions. He co-led a national coalition a couple of years ago that secured $1.5 billion from the feds for urban forestry that was distributed to hundreds of communities across the country. We're going to post two papers, a short version and a long version of Brett's paper that talks about regenerative nature-based solutions. One's an executive summary and one has more of the science and the data. So it is my great joy to welcome Brett KenCairn to Bioneers today.
Good morning. Buenos dias, yate. So good to see you. It's so good to be with all of you. I want to start with a thanks to this place, this remarkable, beautiful place, and to all the keepers of this place who've been here for generations, making it so. I also want to thank Kenny and Nina. Kenny did pass the talking stick to me today to talk about climate change and the state of the climate movement. I come from Boulder, Colorado, a community that has a unique relationship to climate change. We have, as some of you may know, we have 11 federal research labs in Boulder, Colorado. One of them, the National Climate and Atmospheric Research Station, was established in Boulder in 1967. And my community takes climate science really seriously, probably because we have 3,000 climate scientists, literally, that live in our community. There's a sort of inside joke in Boulder that we have more climate scientists than we have therapists and personal trainers. So you've been to Boulder, I guess you get my joke. Thank you. But no, we have been very serious about this for a long time. And in fact, Boulder was one of the first communities in the world when our federal government did not sign on to the first international agreements to reduce emissions. We said we will. And we committed to actually achieving climate emissions reductions as a community. And then we started agitating and working with other communities around the country, and we started building a movement around the world. When I joined in 2013 to help write the next generation of our climate action plans, I was given the opportunity, the great honor, to work with teams all over the world. Helsinki and Stockholm and Rio and Sydney and New York and Seattle and Toronto. It was such an exuberant time. But I need to tell you that many of those cities are quietly withdrawing from this work now. And that there is a sense of despair and hopelessness, actually, in many of us who have been doing this work, because we know that our strategy is failing. And in fact, what I've come to understand is that it has been doomed to failure from the very beginning, because it was based on a false premise and a half-truth. That premise was that it was just about technology, it was just about machines, it was just about the sources of energy, and if we just changed those sources, if we built more wind farms and we put in more solar, and then we had new machines and more electric vehicles and more heat pumps, that we'd solve this problem. That was the half-truth. Because the other half of this truth is something that we have known for over 50 years. In fact, if you go back into the times when we were first starting to come together as a world community to talk about climate change in the 70s, the World Meteorological Organization meeting in 1979, the first papers that were coming out, they all noted that climate change had two legs. Yes, one of those legs was that we were increasingly emitting carbon emissions for the fossil fuel. And nothing I'm saying today is intended to actually diminish the importance of that work. But those times that we knew that there was a second leg. And that second leg was the degradation of the land, the desecration of living systems. Because as it turns out, the atmosphere is not a geochemical machine that's run by CO2 in and CO2 out. It's a life-mediated dynamic. Life created our atmosphere for us, for life. And the degradation of these living systems is what's been driving the instability in that system. And we knew that. And in fact, when the world came together in the 90s for the Real Earth Summits, we knew that there were 3 existential threats that we had to plan for. Yes, climate was one, and we created the Convention on Climate Change, the IPCC that we've heard so much about. But there were 2 other conventions created in that Real Earth Summit. Do you know what they were? Biodiversity, but can you tell me the third? Yes, it was originally supposed to be called the Convention on Land Degradation, but it wasn't actually sexy enough, so they called it the Convention on Combating Desertification. And unfortunately, that led us to believe that, oh, well, that's only a problem in Africa, right? I can show you places right outside of Boulder that are desertifying right now. Because we understood back then that it was also about land degradation. But then we started to forget, and there's some reasons why we forgot and why we chose to just narrow this down to being about carbon. And those are important things to know about. We don't have time to talk about them today, but Rob Lewis in his beautiful blog, Climate According to Life, or Didi Pereshouse, or Walter Yene, one of our senior and elder climate scientists, they remembered. And we need to know why we made this set of choices. But what I would tell you is that it's time for us to actually change our strategies, because there is no hope in the strategy that we've been using. Let me summarize this for you in a way that I think will make some sense in terms of why we've been going in this path. In fact, if I were to ask many of you what was causing climate change and how we were supposed to solve it, you'd probably come back to something like this. In this graph, that pink line is atmospheric CO2. It's the level of CO2 in the atmosphere over time from about, in this graph, about 1700 to now. As you can see, it was rising a little bit, but then you start to see around that time that blue line emerges, and that blue line is emissions from burning fossil fuels. And so, of course, now it looks like, oh, look, they come together and they perfectly match. So there you have it, causation, the smoking gun, or I guess in this case, the smoking stack. This is the cause of climate change. And when you think that climate change is about this relationship, then you are led to believe that the solutions to climate change are all about these technologies. And it becomes just a technical process, which if you're a financier and you like technology, that's a perfect set of things to try to work on. But we've started to learn, as Kenny was referring to, that there's this other cause. The science is finally actually showing some of this in the scientific context. This was a report that was done in 2017 by Jonathan Sanderman and others, looking at soil loss over the last 12,000 years. The very beginning of that graph in the lower left is that first about 10,000 years, very little soil loss. And then about the time of the first empires and the first spreading of almost a sort of pre-industrialization of agriculture, you start to see soil loss increase. But it really takes off, of course, in about the last 100 years, what Sanderman and all found. Something like a quarter to a third of all the excess carbon in the atmosphere did not come from burning fossil fuels. It came from burning our soils. By the way, it's not just about the carbon, because of course what happens when you lose the soils? You lose the capacity of the living systems to hold water. And what have the elders been telling us for generations? It's about the water. And we've also forgotten that that the most predominant greenhouse gas that's causing global warming, it's not CO2 actually, it's water. And so as we have degraded the land, we've also released a huge amount of the water that was in the land into the atmosphere, and that compounds climate change too. But then, of course, there's this other relationship about how fossil fuels used in machinery starts to do this. We have only our own backyards or front yards, depending on where you live in the country, to look. This was the Great Plains, one of the most incredible ecological systems on the planet, which in the course of just 10 years, we plowed 30 million acres of it. And we know how that turned out, and I'll come back to that. But that wasn't just in the United States. We were doing this all over the place. And while we thought it was just about industry and about burning fossil fuels, no, it was about all of this. It was about the degradation of the living world. Climate change swallowed the rest of our environmental awareness, right? Over the last 20 years, have we been talking about anything else? We should have been talking about this, because part of what we see now is that it was about this land degradation process, and the scale of that is just immense. In fact, the UN estimates that something like 70% of the terrestrial world is actually degraded. Last year, a report came out that said about half of the biological capability of the planet has been compromised. And when you look at this from a variety of different angles, what I think, to just sum it up, it's like this. We're living on a planet that's operating at half of its basic photosynthetic capability. In the science terms, the net primary productivity. We don't even know what it's like to live on this planet when it was at its full potential, although we do have the stories. We've been told the stories. Remember the stories about the carrier pigeons, that when they would take flight, the sky would become dark, that the rivers were so full of salmon that you could walk across them. These are not metaphors, that you could stand on the plains and you could look in any direction for miles and it was moving because of millions of buffalo. That's what the planet looked like when it was operating at its full capability. And that's what we have to bring back. That is the only legitimate hope that we have right now to solve the climate crisis. And it looks hopeless right now. But I'll tell you, there were other times when it seemed hopeless. If you haven't watched the documentaries of the Dust Bowl era, you need to do that. And you need to imagine what it must have been like to be on the Great Plains when we lived out the consequences of having plowed 30 million acres and turning it into one species of wheat. And then the dust storm started, and at first it was just a few each year, and then it was like dozens. And they talk about how these walls of dust coming at you that were miles high felt like hell descending on you. It must have felt hopeless then. But we lived in a time then where we believed in ourselves, where we felt like we could do something about that we could go back and start to be with the land again. And we put millions of us back to work on the land. We were making a living, putting the world back together. And guess what? We did. In the course of just a decade, we actually stopped the destruction. And when in another decade, we started putting it back together. We have done this. And that's not the only example. I mean, think of the area that this was destroying, almost a third of our country. But there are other examples. I mean, and just to say that the scale of work that we did together at that time, absolutely remarkable. Planted billions and billions of plants, built hundreds of miles, thousands of miles of contours and check dams. And this is the simple but important work that now needs to be done again. And there's lots of places that this has been done elsewhere too. If you haven't seen the beautiful documentary work that John Liu did about the Loess Plateau, one of the cradles of civilization, a place that we had degraded for thousands of years, that within a few decades of committed action, we actually brought back. If you haven't followed the work of Andrew Millison, who's been documenting what's happening in Asia and Africa right now, it's absolutely remarkable how they're changing. They're not only recovering land, they're changing the climate. Or the work of, again, Didi Pearshouse and Walter Yene with the natural farming movement in India. 800,000 small farmers doing natural farming are not only recovering the land, they're changing their local climates. And finally, I would just talk about back in our Great Plains. I heard a presentation recently from Elizabeth Heilman from Wichita State where she was talking about that parts of Kansas have now adopted regenerative agriculture at such a scale, like 70% of a county has now put their land back into living cover and full deep-rooted systems. And you know what they're seeing? They're changing the weather patterns. Yes. And they even now believe that we know what the minimum scale of action is at landscape scales to be able to change climate. Yes, we can do this. We have done this. We are doing this right now. But it's not just going to be because we changed consciousness or, that we did more education or that we put together a new comms campaign for the planet. It's going to be because we changed the economy. It's like Sarah said yesterday, we have to make it possible to make a living repairing the planet. And we need every gathering like Bioneers, whether it's the Society of Ecological Restoration or any other, to have a track in that about how we build an economy that repairs the world. Because that's what it's going to come down to. So we don't have time today to go into all of that, but I'll just offer you a few thoughts about where you start with this. Well, let me just say, we've done a little work, by the way, scientifically to look at this, and it's very promising. If we just restored about a third of the degraded areas on the planet, we would stabilize climate and, by the way, reverse biodiversity loss. And as a matter of fact, according to the World Economic Forum, we would create 190 million jobs and $3.5 trillion of economic activity. That's the future we have to demand. So, where do we start? I'll just give you 4 points to start with. First is, we have to prepare and plan for this. Just like in the 30s, when things start to unravel, as they will, it's too late if you don't have your plans together, right? The second is, we actually have to have proven and tested the things that we say we should do. So pilot and prove, get out there now, get these things underway. The third is we have to create partnerships at every level, across your back fence, between your jurisdictions, between your countries, and we have to learn fast and figure out how we're going to propagate this quickly. And finally, we have to remember this is going to be a political process. I know it's much more fun to talk about whales and growing things and all those things. I like that too, but it's a political process. So, thank you. Let me just close by saying this. This is daunting. I get it, especially for our young leaders here. It's like, what do we do? But I'll tell you, you can start now, and we're starting in my community in a few simple ways. The first is we have to actually think about how do we remove the barriers for participation in our communities, right? We have to deprofessionalize land stewardship. This is not complicated work. We can all do this, but when it's only the professionals that get to do this, of course, nobody can participate. So we learned this lesson in my own community where we were trying to work with our schools to create new living landscapes that could shelter and protect our schools, and the school district was like, that's great, but I can't take care of them. We realized we weren't going to go anywhere with this project unless we figured this out. And so, for one thing, by the way, put away volunteerism. That was a 20th century concept. We have to recognize that our community members' time and their expertise deserve to be paid for. And it's not sufficient, but it's enough to say that for some people, if we could even just fund them for 10 or 15 hours a month of work at $25 or $30 an hour, they can keep those basic systems going. We can keep the trees watered, we can mulch them, we can care for the plants, we can keep these landscapes going. That's enough. We're going to field 12 land stewards. We've created a program in our community called the Community Land Stewards. And we're piloting this notion of stipending people who are getting trained and assigned to community places. And I believe that we can actually ultimately put hundreds of people in our community to work that way. Second, we do need to actually build an infrastructure for implementing this at scale. So we've started contractor training programs, especially for our small, local, and minority contractors to say, how do we do wildfire resilient landscaping? How do we do rain garden development? How do we do biodiversity protection? And then we, as the public sector, start putting out small contracts and we start seeding that capacity. And finally, we do have to figure out how we're going to fund this at scale. So as part of the Center for Regenerative Solutions, we're working with the Trust for Public Land and their amazing conservation finance team, which quietly over the last 25 years has helped local communities generate billions of dollars of local investment through things like tax initiatives and bond measures, where we could actually get 20 or 30 or 40 million dollars into local projects. And that's what we need to be doing across the country. And we're going to do that. So join in. We can make this happen. So I'll close now to just say this, especially this is from me 40 years ago when I actually, to you, the younger leaders in this crowd, I actually came to the Bay Area 40 years ago, right out of college. And when I got here, I realized how functionally useless most of what I learned in college was. I didn't really know what to do or how to start being a part of this thing that I felt like I wanted to be a part of. And I was fortunate to start to be mentored by a man named Ronaldo Cortez at a little urban farm down near Spanger's Fish Market, where we were growing mini vegetables for trying to compete with Alice Waters. But the point is this: learn how to grow something. Start with something you love, a flower, a medicinal plant, a food plant, what doesn't matter, but grow something. And then figure out how to grow that in a neighborhood of plants that like to grow together. And then figure out how that little neighborhood of plants actually fits into a larger community. And before you know it, you'll find that you've been brought into a larger community that's really happy to have you, and it will help you find that way. Thank you. Yeah.